There is a sex-based classification in this law. It is very difficult to try to explain that away because on the face of the statute that Tennessee passed, they say you cannot have treatment when it's inconsistent with your sex. And I think one of the striking things about yesterday's argument is that the Solicitor General of Tennessee could not find his way out of that straightforward reality of the law that the Tennessee legislature passed that he was trying to defend on the ground that it was sex neutral. Now, all of the conversations in the argument about the alleged risks of the treatment and what's happening in Europe, none of that changes. First of all, it's completely distorted. But of course, none of that changes that Tennessee's law draws this sex-based classification. And that is what Justice Jackson was really trying to get at the end, is that we are not doing this analysis correctly. And she really refocused us on that point.
You just heard from Chase Strangio. He is the ACLU attorney that made the case for gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth this week before the Supreme Court. And on one hand, his presence there is historic because he is literally the first trans person to ever argue a case before the Supreme Court. So it's a big deal. But on the other hand, he was facing an uphill battle against a hostile court that just wasn't receptive to the arguments that he was making. So the law in question was Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming healthcare for minors. Now, as you can see from this graphic, Tennessee is one of 24 states that have recently banned gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth within the past couple of years. And if the court sided with Strangio and held that Tennessee's law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, it would have invalidated the trans healthcare bans in those other 23 states. So this was a case of significant consequence. And the argument that Chase made was that these bans were tantamount to sex-based discrimination, which is a really important argument to make. Now, Ellie Mistal is going to break down the arguments for and against Tennessee's law in the article for The Nation that we're about to read. Quote, "The Tennessee law on its face discriminates on the basis of sex assigned at birth. In Tennessee, a child assigned male at birth can take a testosterone booster, for instance, to deepen his voice and inhibit the development of breasts. But a child assigned female at birth cannot take the exact same drug for the exact same purpose. That is a point-and-click violation of the Constitution. To get around this obvious problem, the lawyer for Tennessee Solicitor General Matthew Rice, argued that the law was not discriminatory because the child assigned male at birth is suffering from a medical condition, delayed growth or puberty, while the trans boy was simply experiencing, quote, psychological distress with her body." Emphasis was Ellie's. Now, Mistal is pointing out here that with the way that Solicitor General Rice is talking about it, he just rejects trans identity altogether. And as you can tell, the argument that they're making doesn't make any sense. Whereas the legal argument that Strangio is making isn't just compelling. It's a key argument that's been used before the court before to win rights for LGBTQ plus people. In fact, if you go back to Obergefell in 2015, when Kennedy wrote the majority opinion for that, he also ruled that same-sex marriage bans were inherently discriminatory in part because women, for example, couldn't marry other women because they're women. It's fundamentally a decision based on sex and gender. Now, in the 2020 Bostock case, Gorsuch, he argued that employment discrimination against LGBTQ plus people was also sex-based. So the argument here today is key. But unfortunately, after 2.5 hours of oral arguments, it's pretty clear, as Axios reports, that the conservative majority will indeed uphold Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for minors. And they go on to explain that Roberts, Barrett, and Kavanaugh all signaled pretty clearly that they will be siding with Tennessee. So that's 3. Now, when you factor in Thomas and Alito, who are also expected to side with Tennessee, you have the 5-4 majority needed to uphold this ban. Barrett just denied the existence of de jure anti-trans discrimination altogether. Roberts basically said that the court doesn't really have the ability to make this decision, therefore it should be left up to the states. And when it comes to Gorsuch, he didn't say anything, so we don't actually know whether or not he would apply the same argument that he made in the Bostock case, but he should, since he literally wrote the opinion for the majority, so it would be preposterous if he went against his own legal argument. But even if Gorsuch did side with the liberals here, it just wouldn't be enough. So prepare yourselves mentally, because in spring, when they release this decision, it's almost certainly not going to go our way. But what does this mean? It simply means that the bans on gender-affirming care in 24 states right now will be allowed to stand, even though they are blatantly unconstitutional. So if you're in a blue state where care is still available, nothing is going to change. And to be clear, this holding will apply specifically to trans youth. So if you're a trans adult in these 24 states, you'll also still be able to have access to gender-affirming healthcare, assuming your state hasn't already taken steps to restrict that too, which has already been the case in states like Florida. But for right now, things are going to stay the same. But it starts to get a little bit more scary when we talk about the implications of this ruling. Because in the event Trump does what he says he's going to do and ban gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth at the federal level, the question then becomes, would Donald Trump's blanket ban stand? And it's honestly hard to say. On one hand, Roberts signaled that he thinks that this is an issue that should be left up to the states. So if him and Gorsuch sided with the liberals, they would have the majority to strike down a blanket ban. But if he rejects the sex-based argument, then he could still side with the conservatives. But with that being said, this court, they're not known for being consistent, so I don't think that we should make any assumptions based on what Robert does here, which he'll likely side with Tennessee, but you can't draw too many conclusions away for it. But it is a reality that we may have to contend with in the near future. And I say this because one of the Christian nationalist fascists who spoke out against trans rights outside of the Supreme Court on the day of oral arguments made a very bold claim.
We are not going to rest until every child is protected, until trans ideology is entirely erased from the earth. That's what we're fighting for.
And I am here to declare that God created us, male and female, in his image. He created us. What you're hearing is the outcry from the demons and those that worship evil, that are abusing our children, brainwashing our children to believe the lie that comes directly from Satan. I have a bill, it's called Protect Children's Innocence Act. It would make it a felony to perform so-called gender-affirming care on any child in America, all 50 states. This bill must be passed. Here's the good news. President Trump, that's coming on January 20th, supports my bill. Our newly elected, soon-to-be Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, is a Senate sponsor, original sponsor of my bill. And the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is a co-sponsor of my bill.
Now, I included Matt Walsh there so people can see how eliminationist rhetoric is just being used out in the open. They're not hiding their agenda, and it is genocidal, quite frankly. But what Marjorie Greene said there is genuinely alarming, because an entire generation of young trans people would effectively be forced to go through the wrong puberty. And the consequences of that would be catastrophic. When gay teens started routinely killing themselves in the 2010s, like Tyler Clementi and Seth Walsh, it forced Americans to grapple with the repercussions of their homophobic policies. These days, we have a plethora of evidence to suggest gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth decreases anxiety, it decreases depression, and also suicidal ideation. These are things that lead to people acting on suicide. It leads to young people acting on suicide. So if Republicans take this healthcare, which alleviates these mental health issues, away, they are knowingly harming these children in a profound way. So even though they think they're protecting children, and they say that they're protecting children, they are hurting children. But I don't want you to think that they're ignorant to this fact, because they're not. They've seen the same data and statistics that we've all seen. It's a choice. They're choosing to be cruel. They want more trans deaths. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene don't just not care if trans youth kill themselves. She actually thinks it would be good. And if you think I'm being too uncharitable, I mean, that is the policy that she is pushing for. It's the outcome she is forcing and facilitating through policy. These people are fucking evil. But as confident as Marjorie Taylor Greene is, I don't think that a national healthcare ban for trans youth is necessarily a foregone conclusion, because Republicans only have a razor-thin majority, so all it takes is a couple of Republican deflections and it goes down. And I promise you, we're not going down without a fucking fight. But even though Republican politicians and propagandists know exactly what they're doing, a lot of regular people, They are duped by these liars. For example, I do want to play a clip for you, and then I want to show you how a Republican mischaracterized it, purposefully so.
These are young people who may have known since they were 2 years old exactly who they are, who suffered for 6-7 years before they had any relief.
So to give you some context, this is a trans man talking about the trans experience, and he is pointing out how children at very young ages begin to make decisions about their gender. At 2 years old, you're obviously not saying, Mama, Dada, I transgender. That's not what's happening. That's not what he's saying. But he's pointing out that some children begin to gravitate towards a specific gender at a very young age. And it's subtle, but it happens. And it's not a definitive sign that they're transgender at 2, but it's important to notice how innate our gender identities are at very young ages. And 2 is less common, to be sure, but around 5. I mean, me, as a member of the LGBTQ community, I'm a cis gay man, I knew that I was gay. I mean, I didn't consciously think I am gay, but I remember my mom saying something like, when you're older, you'll have a girlfriend. And I remember naturally being revolted by that and saying, I don't want a girlfriend, I want a boyfriend. And when she told me that, boys are supposed to have girlfriends and girls are supposed to have boyfriends, I genuinely didn't understand and was confused by that and argued with her about that because it was just natural to me. And the same is true for trans people, for all LGBTQ plus people. It manifests at very young ages, and it's not something that we control. It just happens naturally. Now, some bigots will use an ostensibly pro-gay argument to argue against trans rights. For example, they'll say, well, these signs of gender dysphoria, it's actually just an early sign of somebody who's going to be a homosexual when they're older. Therefore, if parents let their boy become a trans girl as opposed to a gay man, they're going to do that child a disservice. But the regret rate, for one, is very low. And that means that most gender dysphoria diagnoses, the few that are made, there's not a lot, they're accurate. And 2, even though those kids don't know how to describe their feelings, they intuitively know who they are, even if they can't articulate it. So as somebody who knew that he was gay at a very young age, I was effeminate, I was girly, but if my parents tried to force me to wear dresses and play with dolls and grow out my hair and use female pronouns, I would not have liked that, right? I would not have liked that at all. I would have thrown a tantrum, even though I was effeminate and basically bullied by adults for acting like a sissy. I never ever doubted my own gender identity because I was a boy. I've always been a boy and I like being a boy. If my parents tried to make me become a girl, I would not have liked that. And the perception for these folks is that they think that parents are pushing this on children for ideological reasons when that's not happening. That's not happening, right? So what trans people are saying is that you should let kids just be who they want to be. If you're a boy who naturally gravitates towards one gender and you opt for dresses and you identify as a girl, it's healthy to affirm their identity. We're not talking about a medical intervention at this young age. But in response to that short clip that we watched from Chase Strangio, this is how Meghan McCain characterized what he said. Quote, "This right here is why the left has lost the culture war. Saying a 2-year-old should be castrated is nothing short of pure evil out of a science fiction book. Every sentient, normal American knows this and should be horrified by it." Now, we all just saw the clip. That is not what he said. Nobody is saying that. But the reason why they have to lie about gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth and pretend like it exclusively means castration is because they can't argue based on the facts. So they have to lie and be hyperbolic and misrepresent what gender-affirming healthcare is. Because if they actually engaged with what gender-affirming healthcare is accurately, they would not be able to persuade the public that this is something that's bad. I think that most Americans, when educated about this, understand why experts deem it medically necessary. And for all this talk of irreversible genital surgeries on minors, these same people say nothing about the male infants who are unnecessarily circumcised just days after they're born, yet they pretend like the left wants to castrate every trans person, even though those surgeries do not take place until adulthood. So they're liars, and they lie because that's the only way that they can temporarily win this argument. But when it comes to the age of puberty, that is where healthcare becomes important, because if trans youth have shown persistent gender dysphoria, the parent and the doctor, along with the child, determine if puberty blockers or HRT is best. Now, the arguments against this are comparable to arguments that we see against vaccines. Oh, well, there's some risk, therefore, it shouldn't be allowed, since there is indeed a risk. But one of the most important points of the oral arguments for this case came from Justice Sotomayor, who pointed out that trans healthcare, like all healthcare, indeed does carry risks. And she said this in response to Tennessee's Solicitor General arguing that there's a risk of detransitioning.
So they cannot eliminate the risk of detransitioners. So it becomes a pure exercise of weighing benefits versus risk. And the question of how many minors have to have their bodies irreparably harmed for unproven benefits is one that is best left.
I'm sorry, Counselor. Every medical treatment has a risk. Even taking aspirin. There is always going to be a percentage of the population under any medical treatment that's going to suffer a harm.
That's Justice Sotomayor interrupting Tennessee Solicitor General Matthew Rice. Talk about the significance of this moment, Chase.
One thing I'll say that was really powerful was just how passionate, particularly Justices Sotomayor and Jackson were yesterday. Sotomayor focused extensively on the harms to the adolescents at the center of this case and who are having their health care stripped away. And the point I think that she is making that is so important in that exchange with the Solicitor General of Tennessee is that Tennessee is getting up there and saying, we can do this because this medication carries risk. Now, the district court in this case found that Tennessee's allegations of harm and their prevalence were simply not supported by the record. But then, importantly, there is no medical intervention that does not carry risk. That is part of medicine, balancing the risks and benefits. And in all other circumstances, what Tennessee does is allow doctors and parents and then adolescent patients to weigh those risks and benefits and make a decision about what is best for the individual patient. What Tennessee has done here is displaced that thoughtful, often painstaking process that parents and their children have gone through with their doctors and imposed this one-size-fits-all prohibition. And Tennessee really did struggle to justify that sweeping ban that they passed.
See, that's why conservatives have to lie about it. Because when they try to argue against this form of healthcare, which is what it is, based on the merits, their arguments completely fall apart. And Tennessee's Solicitor General is basically arguing that since there is a risk of someone being misdiagnosed with gender dysphoria, that risk of detransitioning is sufficient enough to ban this form of healthcare entirely. Now, yes, there is a risk, of course. But when it comes to gender-affirming surgeries, the regret rate is 1%. But do you want to know what the regret rate is for knee replacement surgery? It's 17%. So by that same logic, we should probably ban knee replacement surgery too. And all surgeries, for that matter, that carry a risk of regret. It is an insane argument to make, which is why they have to lie, right? In court, he can't do that. But people like Meghan McCain and Matt Walsh and Marjorie Taylor Greene, they have to lie about it. Because when you actually learn about the facts, it is undeniable that this is a legitimate form of healthcare that is indeed deemed medically necessary for a reason. But regardless, that argument is still apparently compelling enough to the conservative justices on the Supreme Court because, they're not making an evidence-based assessment. These justices are making an ideological one. But even though lawmakers and justices aren't going to be moved by facts and data because they're hacks, I do still think that normal people can be moved. And when it comes to, a trans teenager who's experiencing gender dysphoria, the best practice is to treat them with hormone replacement therapy if that's what a doctor determines is needed. This has been deemed medically necessary because it is conducive to dramatic improvements in mental health and the alleviation of gender dysphoria. And in banning this type of healthcare, Republicans are literally taking away a specific form of healthcare from young people that they don't like, which is absurd. I mean, it's not uncommon because Republicans try to take away reproductive healthcare from women as well, but it's not up to them. It is a decision that should be left to doctors, parents, and the child. Now, you might not agree with it or understand it, but you have no right to take that away from other families. And I think that Julie Rodzinski said it best on CNN.
Conservatives constantly talk about the fact that they want parents making decisions for their children. That's why they sometimes don't want books in certain schools, because they want the parents to be able to tell their kids what they can and can't read. They sometimes want parents to be able to say whether their kids can take sex ed classes or not. The state shouldn't be able to do that. The parents should be able to do that. And here, conservatives are the ones saying, no, the state knows better than the parents. And you tell me, who knows your child better than the parents?
And that's exactly it. And Republicans benefit from people kind of just defaulting to their argument on this issue. A lot of parents just assume that other parents are pushing this on their children until they realize they themselves have a trans child, and then they are forced to reckon with the necessity of gender-affirming healthcare. Case in point.
I started noticing the gender dysphoria when Maya was really able to play with toys.
It was really from the time she could talk. She was like saying things like, I'm a girl, or when I grow up, I'll be a princess and I'll have long hair like Rapunzel. We used to say, like, you're a boy, but you can like girl things. That's okay. She was just always telling us who she was. Coming to understand that our child was transgender was not something that happened overnight. This was years of therapy, and it was a very long process. She was like a very anxious, depressed, weepy child. She would lick her lips till they were raw. She used to bite her nails till they bled.
And then once she was able to transition,
it was like the light switch got turned on inside of her.
Instantaneously. I mean,
it was like the first time we saw real joy in our child.
How did it feel once you were able to socially transition?
I felt good because I wasn't like trapped in that feeling of, okay, I'm never going to be able to show my true self. And like, my life is horrible. Like, it's not going to be like that anymore. I could be happy.
And this is a pretty typical story, and I'll link you to the full documentary down below if you want to watch it. But these are just regular people who happen to have a child with gender dysphoria. And they fought this idea that their child was trans at first, but I mean, when your child needs care, you might debate what the best kind of care is, but at the end of the day, if you're a good parent, you're going to do what's best for your child. If you see that they're suffering and you need help, you're going to do everything you can to alleviate their suffering. And gender-affirming healthcare works. To take that away from that family and that child, to have the state intervene and dictate what medical care these parents can and can't have for their child, isn't just cruel, it is downright fucking evil. I mean, if a child had cancer and the doctor recommended chemotherapy is brutal on that child's body. It's brutal on anyone's body, even adults. So they would have to make that choice, you know? Do you think that's appropriate for the government to step in and say, actually, we think that chemotherapy is a little bit too intrusive and there's too much risk, therefore, we're not going to allow that? In that scenario, it would be preposterous. But these folks are trying to get people to believe that gender-affirming healthcare isn't healthcare. They're trying to get you to believe that it's aesthetic and it's just castration, when that's patently false. But I mean, even though the battle has presumably been lost right now at the Supreme Court, let me tell you this, the war is not over. We all need to redouble our efforts to protect LGBTQ plus youth and reject the framing from the right wing. They are not the ones protecting kids. They are hurting kids. They are kid killers. If Marjorie Taylor Greene gets her law passed, she'll be responsible for the social murders of an entire generation. So we need to educate people, but we also need to be confrontational, especially with people in power. These Republicans are kid killers, and we need to call them that again and again until it sticks, so normal people begin to question, why are they calling these Republicans kid killers? And then if that gets them to educate themselves and look up why parents seek out this care for their children, then I think as a society, we can maybe move in a better direction. But it's going to be a really long fight and an uphill battle, but buckle up because we are going to fight